she referred to everyone. I think probably we could get on first name terms before the end of, before the end of the session. 10,752,683,510. I think that's what that figure is. That's the amount of records compromised already that we know of up until the end of October this year. So as was kindly introduced, I'm Stuart Frost. I head up a team in the DWP. We pay out around about £175 billion per annum in benefits and pensions. Around about 22 million people receive those. That's £650 million every day, and the staggering stat there is that's 35% of the UK banking activity. We have 75,000 staff in 750 buildings, of which 700 are open to the public, 950 systems and applications, 850 suppliers that we know of, and that's before we get to the subcontractors and the subcontractors to the subcontractors. And lastly, we have the data assets of the UK population, which when I checked last week was around about 67,610,000. It's going up all the time. So that's just to contextualise the work we do in the DWP. And please, there isn't many of us in the session, but let's try and make it interactive. If anybody's got any questions at any point in time, or you can compare your organisation, or you want to ask anything, please just do so. So back to that startling figure. There's been nearly 4,000 security breaches so far in 2019. And the average cost of those data breaches is a significant amount of money for the organisation. There's a move to cloud first. Cloud first is fantastic. 70 million records were stolen from poorly configured S3 buckets in 2018. Now an S3 bucket is in Amazon, it's like a file, it's just like a file. If it's not configured correctly, it's like any piece of software. If it's not configured correctly, it's like having a brick wall and leaving some bricks out and putting your hand through and pinching something. So there's nothing wrong with cloud storage. It's the basic configuration that's the problem. Supply chain attacks rose by 78% in 2018. That is a huge stat. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Target breach in America. Target themselves weren't breached, it was through their supply chain that was breached. And it was a simple phishing attack. They found their suppliers through open source information and they sent a phishing email. And a member of staff simply clicked on the phishing email and the malware was downloaded and they got its credentials and were able to target Target. But what happened in that supply chain? Who was looking closely at the supply chain to make sure the security was up to date and scratch and they were attesting to the state of their security controls? Every 39 seconds, somebody somewhere in this world is under cyber attack. And the average time to identify a breach is 197 days. So that means somebody or something is on your network for a long time before it's detected. And that's a staggering figure that's estimated to be. Now that's all bad news. And please remember here that there's nearly now 3 million security positions unfilled globally. So that's good news and bad news really. The good news is for people in here, for example, there's great opportunities for jobs in there, but there's also a lot of unfilled positions. So how do we gain increased security assurance underpinned by a GRC culture? So for far too long, and if you heard me on the panel this morning, I said something similar. Security has been that corporate policeman. The policeman that comes along at the end and says, oh no, you can't do that. You can't do that. It gave people a bad name. It's like one of my dogs. They bark at everything, but after a while, people ignore it. And nobody wants to know. People don't want, they bypass security. So we change it. We change it to you can do that if. But how do we do that? And we do that by starting to integrate at the start of all projects. It's no good coming along when something's ready to go into production and saying, you've not done X, Y, and Z, you can't go live. Get in at the outset of the projects and the programs. Work with them in agile development. Make security an integral part of the features. Security by design is a lot easier if it's done from the outset, and work with the product owners to do that. So, basic risk management. A threat, asset, and a vulnerability. Everybody comfortable? If one's missing, you've not got a risk. Now, we don't do vulnerability management. You go to a lot of events and there's a lot of solutions being marketed for you, but you don't actually know if you've got a risk that you need that solution for. We don't do vulnerability management. We do risk management. So just let's have a look at some of the basics for risk management, for how we gain that increased security assurance. Assets. Anything of value to your organisation. Anything. Whether that be people, technology, intellectual property, anything. Configuration management database. That shows how your systems and processes link together, what the upflows are, what the downflows are, how your assets link together, so if something else compromises, you know what the knock-on effect will be. This is all the things you need to fully know about to do essential risk management. Culture. Culture. That's the number one priority. If you have a breach in your organisation, it is the board that is accountable for that breach. They must set the tone, they must set the culture in your organisation. This is a common one that people get confused. We've touched briefly. People focus on vulnerability management. No, let's focus on the risk management. You do not have to fix every vulnerability. The cost of a potential loss might be less than the cost of the control, for example. You do not have to fix every vulnerability. People get this confused. They talk about, well, what's your risk tolerance? Well, actually, you need an appetite first to tolerate from. Again, that is the responsibility of the board to set that risk appetite. They may want to spend the money on something rather than fixing a security risk. There is many decisions a board have to make around risk. Security is one part of risk, of course. Enterprise risk, financial risk, operational risk. I've mentioned accountability rests with the board. You cannot pass it down. So one of the common things we hear is, I cannot fix that risk because I haven't got the tools to do so. Well, I drive a car, and if it goes wrong, I can't fix it. But I hold somebody to account for fixing it. I hold a mechanic to account. He fixes it on a certain day, to a certain time, to a certain standard, and then I test that he's done it correctly. Alternatively, I might decide to take the risk, accept the risk, and there's nothing wrong with accepting a risk. I know full well I may break down, or I may get pulled over for driving illegally. I can't blame the mechanic. It's my car. I'm accountable, and it's exactly the same theory we need to talk about, just to simplify it. Responsibility. Not the same person who has accountability is not necessarily responsible for the solution. It might be a digital solution, you might need your technology department to do it, but the accountable person holds them to account. The responsible person for fixing the solution is different from the accountable person. Security architects. Essential part of your team, security architects, really, from a risk perspective. They work hand in glove with your risk practitioners and your GRC professionals. The architects bring that deep technical knowledge, your risk practitioners bring that knowledge of the risk process, and together, along with the GRC professionals who can bring in the compliance and governance elements, you should end up with a pretty good team. Now, the lines of defence we'll touch on in a minute, but you can have security architects in both lines of defence, and we can explore that in a little while. Policies. Got to have policies. You've got to have standards derived from your policies. You've got to have controls that meet your standards. Okay. Anybody got any questions or observations so far from your own organisations? Is anything not stacking up? How is security perceived then? Question. In your organisation. Are you welcomed in open arms to every single meeting and think security will really help us get through here? We'll get this rolled out in record time. You are? No, didn't think you would be. Not in the main. So this for me is about, I mentioned earlier about the corporate policeman, about the dog that barks. This is about emotional intelligence, and I think security have to change the way they operate. It's very difficult this for deep technologists, because if they're talking to the business owner and say, right, okay, you've got a cross-site scripting vulnerability and you're subject to a client-side code injection attack, then they might as well be talking in Arabic. You've got to change the way you talk to people to be welcomed in. So the analogy I gave earlier is you build a wall and leave the bricks out and put your arm through and steal the data. It's the same scenario. You just got to use that emotional intelligence and think how you're perceived when you're talking to the business. Question for you guys. Do you know the level of security maturity in your organisations? Can I pick on somebody? To make it easy, there's 5 levels of security maturity. Anybody thinking here they're at level 5, which is optimising? Don't know if you can read that right at the back. It's proactive, it's the highest level of maturity, continuous improvement. Everything's perfect, essentially, from a security perspective. Anybody think there are 5? Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Anybody think there are 1? Reactive, inconsistent, ad hoc, poor coverage. Right, so let's try 3 then. Who thinks there are 3? Who thinks they're bang in the middle? Who hasn't got a clue then? You don't know? Yeah. Organisations need to think what it will cost sometimes to get to level 5. But I have never yet seen anybody operating at level 5. Personally, I'd say my own area is probably managed coming towards defined. But you can get independent assessments on your security maturity, and it is worth knowing because you can target it and you can know where to improve. All government organisations in the UK do it annually. They self-assess, so you are able to target your particular areas for improvement, whether it's in personnel security, whether it's in risk management, whether it's in tooling. You know exactly where you need to improve, but the onus is on you to do it honestly. It's worth having a check when you go back to your businesses. One of the problems we have with risk management is that certainly in large-scale organisations, you've probably got too many assets. Who would say in their organisations that they know exactly where all their assets are? Anybody? Do you have a complete asset record? I would hold my hand up and say, I don't think we do. Do you have that configuration management database I spoke about? You used to be able to be okay with your assets really, because if you had hardware, if you had a tangible asset, like a piece of kit, you knew where it was. But we've got non-tangible assets these days. We spin up virtual environments, virtual servers. They're here today, they're gone tomorrow. You just simply can't keep a track of them. The sheer volume of assets, there's thousands and thousands and thousands, and this really makes asset-based risk assessment, for example, really challenging. Who's valued all the assets? Who knows the value of assets in their organisation? How valuable is a particular asset in meeting a business objective? Do you know where it sits against the security triad of confidentiality, integrity and availability? Again, it's really challenging. On-premise, off-premise, cloud storage, cloud, the advent of cloud. Nothing wrong with the advent of cloud. Again, this was discussed in a panel this morning. It's basic failings that cause the breaches in the cloud. Misconfigurations of software and applications. On first scan, around 85%, I think it is, of application developments have vulnerabilities in them. But who's following the process? And let's focus on likelihood for a minute. do we need likelihood in risk assessment? Who's running the risk application in metric stream or alternative software? Anybody? Thank you. Hang on, we're at a risk session here. Let me run through this again. So do we need likelihood? There's many a time where people can argue, well, I think the likelihood of that is a 4, I think it's a 3, well, I think it's a 2, and this goes on. So, let me give you, and this is just my view. So, what's the likelihood of you being involved in a car crash? Pretty slim, I would reckon. But you always put your control on. You always put your seatbelt on. I don't know if anybody cycles, but you put your cycle hat on and the likelihood of getting is pretty low. Always lifebuoys, near rivers, near swimming pools. Always fire alarms. And the likelihood of this building burning down is probably pretty slim. But the controls are here and nobody's looked at the likelihood. And how many times do you stay in a hotel room where you see that sign on the back of a door? Now I might be quite sad here because I always look at that. And sometimes I'll even walk the roofs. But why wouldn't I? Why? The likelihood of the hotel, these guys down here think it's really funny. But why wouldn't I? If you're on the 20th floor of a hotel, do you not need to know your way out? It's a basic control. I don't think of the likelihood of something happening. I put my own personal controls in place so I know how to move if something happens. And that's why I talk about likelihood. So in my own organisation, we're moving away. You've missed the best bit, guys. Nearly done now. That's all right. We're moving to what I would term controls assurance, rather than risk assessing every single thing. So this would start with understanding your business aims and objectives. Yeah. Risk management is all about delivering those aims and objectives in your organisation. We're here to make it happen safely and securely. We're here to enable. Security is here to enable, not stop, it's here to enable. We would start with a criticality assessment. And that would be done by first line. Everybody know what first and second line is, by the way? The criticality assessment would look at that particular asset, that particular system or process or whatever it was, and how does it sit in relation to delivering those business objectives. So I don't care about a system that's designed to support the delivery of the sandwiches in the canteen. We care about a system that's there to hit the core objective, whether that's, in my case, paying people benefit, etc., etc. You'd then have a weighted question set, and that would identify the fragility of the system. So, for example, does that system hold PII, protected personal information? Is it internet facing? Is it a key component of paying people, etc.? Then you'd link that to your controls. You would have a defined, depending on your answers, you would have a defined set of controls. And that removes the subjectivity from the risk management program. Start that again, Stuart. That removes the subjectivity because it doesn't focus on likelihood. So, let me quickly move through that. Just for everybody, that's the lines of defence. Your first line is the line that owns the risk. Your second line assesses those controls. So your first line should actually do that control self-assessment. They assess themselves, not the second line. The second line will come along and assure that they've done it correctly. They'll test it. They might fire blank packets at firewalls to test that the firewalls are effective. It might just be a policy thing they want to check. But the second line do that because control self-assessment, to be honest, it has to be honest. Are people always honest? It's the second line that will give you the assurance, and it's independent assurance, and that's important, independent assurance. That can then go into a report. You've got to do something about it. So that's where your governance kicks in. It's got to go to the board so they can understand their key systems in delivering their objectives. How secure are they? What controls are in place? What are effective? What aren't in place? But security's job is not only to report the failings and the controls that are in place, but then to work with them to put those controls into place. And that's important. Again, we're there to enable the business and work with them. Don't forget to the link to the business objectives. And key here for me is, if you're in a large organisation, you don't have an infinite amount of funds for security and to fix things. And if you've got a lot of risks, you can sometimes get lost in the sheer volume of risks. If you look down at the business criticality of your systems and where you need to target controls, you get more proportionate and target spend. Remember, on security, security has to be good enough. You will never remediate every risk. You will never wipe every risk out, but you can manage every single risk. And it's about doing your due diligence. So, GRC governance. We're at a GRC governance conference. That for me is a simple model of how I see it working in practice. So your board govern the business with security policies and controls, and your chief security officer, and I say chief security officer specifically there rather than CISO, chief information security officer, because for me today security has to be holistic. I think we're overly focused on cyber when there is other areas of security such as personnel security, physical security, education and awareness, incident management, tooling outputs. It all has to come together to provide a fully inclusive GRC approach to security. Your first line, you build, you configure, you run. They agree those controls and they implement them and manage their own risks. They're the first people. They do what's called control self-assessment. They test their controls. And then lastly, the second line, monitor compliance, control effectiveness and report up to that board, as I've said earlier. There is a third line, of course, independent audit. They will then come in and check that that process is actually being done. Question. Which is the most important, governance, risk or compliance? I'm not moving on until I get an answer. Governance? Anybody? Any other takers on governance? I was asked this question some time ago and it did make me think actually. But I think it's governance, and I'll go on to tell you why I think it's governance. Just a quick quote for you. Anybody know that quote? Anybody seen that quote anywhere before? So who made that quote? I don't know where to start with what went wrong with that, but the steel and the rivets were substandard with the Titanic, cut the costs on them. There was any number of iceberg warnings ignored. It could have been avoided, so the controls weren't complied with and no governance was able to remedy that. So, the difference between compliance and governance. Compliance is really process. Whereas, compliance is outputs. How you get somewhere, what you need to do. Your governance focuses more on the process, about how you get there. Okay, so it's possible to be compliant, but still have appalling governance. So let's just look at a few examples. 1494, Medici Bank is the first documented governance failing. This was a prosperous, respected bank. It was the papal bank, looked after the money of the Pope. The owner of the bank, the father of the bank, died and left it to people. They didn't have a clue what to do. They just spent and spent and spent and spent extravagantly, and the bank was lost. because no governance stopped them doing it. And that's way back in 1494. All this information is there on the internet. You're able to have a look at it if it interests you. Fast forward to 1995. Anybody heard of the Barings Bank? Anybody heard of Nick Leeson? Yeah. Nick Leeson was working out in Asia, and his job was, in simple terms, to buy one currency and then trade it off against another currency. But he didn't do that. He kept the currencies. There was absolutely no segregation of duties allowing him to do that. He signed off his own work. People were actually ignored who raised concerns about this. Round about the same time as an audit was due to take place, Nick Leeson confessed. Now, I don't know if that's by chance or he knew the audit was coming. He'd run up losses of £827 million by continuing to gamble. He got 6.5 years in jail for that. Mind you, they say crime doesn't pay. Did anybody see the 1999 film Rogue Trader? Because that was based on Barings Bank and Nick Leeson. And this was all about risk and corporate responsibility, and they failed miserably. It brought the bank down. Barings Bank was lost because of this. Nick Leeson now is active on the after-dinner circuit, telling people about this. Fast forward even closer to this time. This was put up in a session this morning. I think this personally is absolutely scandalous. Everybody know about this one, the VW one. This was what I would call cheat software. They put software on their cars, and incidentally 11 million cars were affected in this scandal. And this cheat software could recognise when they were being tested. And the cars, the software showed that the emissions were 35% less, 35 times less than what they were in reality. How on earth could that happen? VW have since paid $4.7 billion to the US as a result of this. And it's likely that they couldn't meet the stringent targets for emissions, but they were still chasing the sales, still chasing the profits. Why were they not caught on this? This is basic non-compliance. Where's the governance that allowed this to happen? And to bring it even further up to date, we've got Thomas Cook. Now, Thomas Cook were £3.1 billion in debt. And it's not, they didn't go under because people weren't taking holidays anymore. There's more people take holidays than there were ever before. They were too far in debt. Where were the early warning systems? Where was the processes? Where was the governance? Why didn't they reduce the debt before it got too late? The point I'm trying to get to here is that you've got to have in your organisation clear and transparent governance. Your governance boards have got to be independent. They've got to effect that challenge. They've got to have the knowledge. Professionals have got to be listened to. Otherwise, 1494, right up to date. I was asked last week, where do we think security will be in 10 years' time? Well, we've come from 1494, we've not learned any lessons. It's still allowed to happen because people aren't doing the basics. So I'll put this next fact. This is Equifax, and I'm conscious we have a lady here from Equifax at the conference today. She's not in here, is she, before I put the slide up? But this is a great example again. Equifax. You all heard of the Equifax case in America? Well, Equifax was breached, and the reason Equifax was breached, quite simply, is because they did not patch a vulnerability. It was a known vulnerability, and they chose not to patch. Why? I don't know. I know people lost their jobs, but the facts from Equifax are actually quite interesting. 2 and a bit months, the attackers were on those networks without being discovered. I don't think the logs were being analysed correctly. So again, I'm back to the basics. If you have a control in place, such as protective monitoring, you have to analyse the logs. It's no good just having a tick in the box to say we've got this control. Analyse the logs. Do something with the logs. That's a heck of a lot of customers that had their data lost. 143 million. And that's what they had to pay out. $125 per person. And in the event following that breach, they've spent a staggering amount of money to upgrade their security. This could have been avoided if they'd patched. Now, interestingly, not one identity can subsequently be traced back to that. Now, there is theories, again, this is openly available on the internet, that it was a state-sponsored attack, and this particular state is creating a huge data lake of American identities to use at a later date. Now, I'll go right back to my opening slide. This is cybersecurity, security in general is not something we're going to resolve, sadly. It's an ongoing process that we're going to have to manage, we're going to have to deal with. But we can deal with it effectively and cost effectively, actually, by getting the basics right and doing our risk management. That figure will be well over 11 billion now. You can tell, can't you? It's running at about £1 billion a month. And don't forget, this is only the ones that are reported. But if we can patch, for example, on time, we can check the patching policy is being complied with. If we can look at our supply chains, get the suppliers to attest, ask for copies of their internal control reports, statement of internal control reports, get copies, independently verify what they're telling you. It's the easiest way into your systems through the supply chain. What's their security education like? What's the behaviours like? And I say behaviours rather than awareness, because the analogy again I'll draw on is smoking. There's 100% awareness that smoking is bad for you. But people still smoke. It says it on every packet, doesn't it? Smoking kills, but people still smoke. So we have to change people's behaviours around security so that it becomes like sitting in that car and putting your seatbelt on. They know what to look for on a phishing attack. They don't just click the link. They know what to look for. Give them examples of real phishing emails. We don't do that. We do targeted phishing and attacks, spear phishing attacks. But do we ever show our staff real phishing emails and say, look what we've blocked? It's around changing those behaviours now. So I have nothing more to add to the presentation. You've got two choices. You can either ask me a lot of questions or you can go and get an early cup of tea or coffee. It's entirely up to you. But let me open this for questions, please, and thank you for your time. Anybody got any questions? Mr. Bannister, sir.
Thanks, Stuart. You opened with the triad of threat, vulnerability, and something else, which gave rise to risk. Asset. And I think you also said that you can't ever patch every vulnerability, and you don't need to, because sometimes the cost of control is lower than the cost of the breach.
Yeah.
And then we obviously saw the Equifax example where they either chose that route deliberately or unknowingly to not patch. How do you think about rank ordering the vulnerabilities and knowing which ones to patch? And do you have a sort of a formal mechanism with those three so you know you're confident when you're not patching that you are safe in doing so? That makes sense.
So I don't think I said don't patch. I said you don't have to fix every vulnerability. So there's many vulnerabilities other than patching. So from a security perspective, a security vulnerability should be patched. Now, just to contextualise that, there's currently around 119,000 known vulnerabilities documented today from a security perspective. That's a hell of a lot of vulnerabilities. They don't all have exploits to take advantage of those vulnerabilities there. That's the key thing. But a security vulnerability should be patched as soon as the patch is available, unless performance testing dictates otherwise. And then you test your performance, you do your regression testing and get that patch in as soon as possible before people can take advantage of that vulnerability. So from a security perspective, yes, it should be patched. Hiya.
Hey Stuart, thanks. You mentioned in your presentation about a criticality assessment questionnaire that you're going to use for control assurance and driving your, I think, risk framework, right? So, I mean, can you talk a little bit more about this criticality assurance questionnaire? So, I mean, I've heard this in many conversations, but I mean, I'm assuming this is being filled out with the first line business people, right? So in order to make sure that they understand the context and the importance of this questionnaire and the values that are filled in, obviously they drive a lot of downstream decision making, right? So I mean, if you can talk a little bit through the content itself, and then how are you ensuring that the first line understands the value of this questionnaire, that'll be great.
Good question. I think with the criticality question set, you don't necessarily have to have security expertise. You just have to be able to answer honestly and accurately. So, is your system, for example, internet facing? If it is, then it'll score higher than if it's not. Does it store personal identified information? You don't need security knowledge to answer those questions. Now, the problem is, on any controlled self-assessment, people will get wise to it and realise certain directions of answers will mean less controls, etc., etc. So there is going to be, or there is an element of sample testing those criticality questionnaires to make sure that the answers are given are the right ones, because otherwise we'll end right back up at square one. And sadly, as you've seen from those examples, the one thing that does focus people's minds is a security breach. If you've talked to people that were involved in the talk breach, for example, all their lessons learnt came afterwards. It did at Equifax, it did at Target. Target, incidentally, I think their attack was on a Black Friday.
That's right.
Yeah, is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
They chose to carry on trading.
Yeah.
Because they put the profits against containing their problem. So it was a disaster. So it removes the subjectivity, it removes the knowledge, but there is going to have to be a second line test of that criticality questionnaire to make sure. And it's like everything. It doesn't come in isolation. It's going to have to be supported by really good security education and targeted security education to say, look, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, this could go wrong. So let's look at an example. Pci Dss, everybody familiar with the payment card industry data security standard? British Airways, nobody from British Airways, is it? No, good. British Airways were breached earlier this year by not complying with Pci Dss, and credit card details were stolen. A heck of a lot of credit card details were stolen. And the ICO has just given the green light, not only for the fact that BA got fined, but they've given the green light to everybody that got affected by that to sue them. It's going to cost millions. So take a real life example and say in your organisation, look, we're not complying with Pci Dss. Look what could happen. And I think if you can start to quantify, it's very difficult to quantify security risk. If you put a financial figure on it, you make your board think. So I don't know if that goes somewhere to answering your questions. I've got colleagues down here that are working in DWP on this criticality question set. Is there anything that you would like to add, guys, that I haven't said?
No.
Good, moving on.
I think For us, we're trying to put them in tiers. So if it's a tier 1 question, it has more controls or more levels that you would need to look at. So I think we've tried to manage expectations to understand if a system's of a lower category, there is less reason to worry about. It still needs the controls, but there's measures in place to try and give our teams that understanding of where their priorities need to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we've got 850 systems. Yeah, we can. With an asset-based risk assessment, your risks we have to have some way of prioritising. And there's firms with way more than 850 systems. And as I said earlier, not bothered about the sandwich one. I'm not bothered about ones that are tucked deep inside the perimeter, they've got lots of countermeasures out. I'm bothered about the systems that are part of the critical national infrastructure, that are there to pay people their benefits. If we don't pay people benefits, we've got a major problem. So it's those key systems that we need to focus on in terms of meeting the business objectives, which for us are paying people benefit or getting them into work. We have to do that. So where are our key controls to protect those systems? Protective monitoring, for example. Are we analysing the logs? Are we checking the logs? If anything's strange, is somebody actually going away and looking at it? And then, are we feeding that in and looking at how we can do continuous improvement? So, the holistic approach, the education, the continuous education has got to support the risk process. Right at the back. He's got the, you can come right to the front if you want.
Yeah, good. So it struck a nerve with me when you mentioned the difference between governance and compliance. I was once in a job interview for head of IT governance, and I was a bit tired and maybe lost control and complained about my current job at the time, of having a lot of audits and how exhausted I was from that. And then the person interviewing me, I don't remember what position he was, but he said, "Oh, but this job is all about compliance and audit." So then I knew that I'm not really sure I want to work there at the time. So do you see that often? I mean, probably that's why I brought it up, but so is that an issue you see? And another question, so the criticality assessment, would you say it's like a business impact assessment? Obviously it's in a government institution, it doesn't make sense to call it business, but...
Not necessarily like a business impact assessment, because all your systems should have a business impact assessment anyway. Essentially to look at what happens if you lose that system. How long will it take you to stand back up? How long will it take you to recover the data? How much data can you afford to lose, etc., etc. Your key point there was the compliance and governance thing, and let me give you an example. Again, another example of a company, an actual company. It was in the States, Wells Fargo. Does anybody know about the Wells Fargo one? Wells Fargo had targets for their customers for the number of accounts they had to have, and staff were incentivised to, for want of a better phrase, create accounts. I know they met their targets, they complied with their targets, but there was a huge amount of false, fraudulent accounts set up. And it was absolutely appalling. Over 5,000 people lost their jobs because of this. But they complied with their targets. And people started to realise when they started to get... They falsified the addresses and everything, but gradually things started dripping through to their clients. And they wondered what had happened. And they uncovered hundreds of thousands of falsified accounts. So yes, they complied. They hit their target. But where was the governance? Where was the board directing it? Where were people saying, this is wrong? So there is a distinct difference between compliance and governance. And business impact assessments, BIAs, come in more absolutely close link to security because of the availability issue, etc., etc. But for me, that is disaster recovery, business continuity, etc., etc. Does that help?
For sure, I meant the concept of the BIA.
Oh, the concept of the BIA, it got to be done. I could have added that to my list of when I had the list, I think, was it on that page? Can't remember. Yeah, the basics, I could have added that to that list. You've got to have one for every system. Business impact analysis, what happens if this goes down? If you lose it, what do we do? You've got to have it. I don't know how we're doing for time. Anybody know how we're doing for time? We've got 5 minutes. Any other questions? Everybody okay? Thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. I hope it wasn't too cold in here for you. We could do with the heating turned up a notch for next year, if we can. Well, thank you very much. You've got 5 minutes extra for your cup of tea. Thank you. Thank you.